Hi, Chip. It's so great to see you today. Thanks so much for coming over to talk to me.
Thanks, Nikki. Wonderful to be back. Thanks for having me.
Let's get right into it. You were the head of the U.S. delegation to the Financial Action Task Force and have spent a lot of time in your career working with different countries to enhance their AML CFT and sanctions regimes. So, what would you say are some of the key and most common challenges jurisdictions face in meeting global AML CFT standards?
Great question. I've had a good amount of time to think about this. As you know, I stepped down from that role in 2013, and it was a pivotal time because we had just finished revising the recommendations after a 10-year run of assessments where it became very clear that for all countries, there was a common challenge of demonstrating effectiveness of implementing the standards that we had put in place after 9/11. And part of that challenge was that the requirements themselves after 9/11 became both much more expansive and I would argue much more relevant to countries around the world in integrating AML systems with CFT systems and sanctions regimes. It's a very hard thing to do, and we can get into it, I'm sure we will later. And so the predictable effort by jurisdictions in the first instance was to adopt laws and regulations and put in place authorities that could be accountable and responsible for meeting these recommendations. It was not really focused on demonstrating the effective application of those authorities to achieve results and outcomes that ultimately make a real dent in the financial crime that we worry about across money laundering, the terrorist financing that we see as an essential component to combating terrorism, or the sanctions regimes that were still and still are relatively new for so many countries. So effectiveness, in short, was the problem. And the way that effectiveness could be demonstrated and putting into the revised standards in 2013, 2012, and then 2013, the methodology to assess compliance with those standards was a difficult task. And I think over the past 11 years, as that set of assessments was conducted under those standards, the challenge of effectiveness has, if anything, become only more apparent. Because there are two questions that have emerged since that time in 2013 when we implemented those standards and revised them. Over the last 11 years of assessments, it is more clear than ever that countries are investing more than ever into AML, CFT sanctions, but are more frustrated, perhaps than ever, about what are seen as not necessarily effective results of those investments. And so it raises these questions of, are we investing in the right places? And are we doing this in ways that ultimately disrupt the threats that we see across money laundering, terrorist financing, and financial crime? So that's really, in my view, continues to be the big challenge for everyone, is looking at effectiveness.
Speaking of AML CFT regimes and sanctions, these have historically been separate disciplines. But in recent years, they've been converging. And I know you have experienced this firsthand in your roles in both the public and private sector. So can you talk about this convergence and give us a couple of specific examples?
I could stay on this all day. This is a great topic, and obviously central to everything that we're trying to do in the financial integrity mission of protecting our financial system from illicit actors and activities. As we defined those illicit actors and activities to move beyond the initial predicate offenses to money laundering, which for our audience, they may or may not be aware of this, but AML grew out of a problem of combating drugs. And we were not, as a global community, capable of attacking the drug trade effectively by just going after the product. So we went after the money side. And then as that became demonstrably impactful, the move to address all serious crime as predicate offenses to money laundering became clear throughout the 90s. And ultimately, with the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the move to expand AML to CFT took that extension not only further, but at a different level of national security importance, right? And with that jump from drug trafficking to all serious crime, from all serious crime to terrorist financing, we widened the authorities and the audiences and the stakeholders to the mission in ways that become complicated and difficult to manage So to your point, there has been a segmentation, a balkanization of the mission in ways that are now going to have to be converged to become more effective. And that balkanization, to fix that, it helps to understand for a moment where that comes from, so that we can think about how we overcome those challenges. And as all serious predicate offenses to money laundering became apparent, you had different authorities in law enforcement. Think of the United States. We have DEA, that is primacy in drugs. We also have the FBI, and we have Customs, and we have Secret Service, and we have alcohol. At least we used to have alcohol, tobacco, firearms, the IRS, and others, and of course all the state and local authorities. So as you expand the remit to cover all serious crime, there are more and more authorities to have to coordinate and to ultimately work into an effective strategy and solution. That's before you get to terrorist financing. Now, when you get to terrorist financing, you're moving beyond law enforcement to national security authorities. You're moving into intelligence communities. You're moving into defense communities that traditionally have no remit or experience in combating crime. We're talking about national security threats, collective security threats. That's another layer of essential integration that has to happen to make this mission seamless. As we move from AML and CFT into sanctions, sanctions is a really interesting bridge because sanctions are designed to address threats to collective security, national security, and our foreign policy. So foreign policy becomes a very important component to this. And then the integration and implementing sanctions of our financial communities, starting with the banks, but all the non-bank financial industries, to law enforcement and regulators, to national security authorities becomes even more apparent. So that balkanization coming from the expansion of the mission was almost inevitable, and wanting to segment out, well, if it's CFT, then that ought to go to our counterterrorism authorities that are largely in defense or in intelligence. If it's sanctions, it should go to our foreign policy communities dealing with the UN and threats to collective security. But if we're going to implement all this effectively, then this has to come together. And the integration of AML, CFT, and sanctions is a huge part of the challenge of effectiveness, where you take these disparate communities and you leverage what each of them has to do off of a foundation that's common to all of it. And here's where we've spent a lot of our time, whether in the public sector or private sector, we being effectively the AML, CFT, sanctions community, recognizing that we can't advance any of these essential elements of the mission without a foundation of transparency. So how do we understand who's operating in our financial system? Who is sending money? Who's receiving money? For what purpose? If we don't have basic answers to those basic questions, there's no way that we can talk about source of funds being proceeds of crime from money laundering, regardless of the predicate offense. There's no way we can talk about the use of proceeds to support terrorist organizations or activities, regardless of the source of those funds. There's no way we can tell whether we have sanctioned actors or activities or jurisdictions in our financial system, because we don't have the transparency to assess risk before we know how to manage it. And so much of the work that we've done to try to integrate AML, CFT, sanctions has been to understand that there's a common baseline of transparency that's required to assess risk of all stripes. And then secondly, with that transparency, recognize that our first actors in responding or identifying risk often don't understand what the risk is. They just know something looks off. And they know it looks off without understanding that, oh, this is obviously a drug trafficking transaction, or this is an extortion transaction, or terrorist financing transaction, or sanctions. It just is something that is unusual in the course of the business that then you have to chase down and try to figure out what may make that transaction, relationship, or deal potentially problematic. And that's where that common baseline of transparency starts to feed into processes and expertise that then has to become nuanced. So while we have this integration challenge around financial transparency, we also have then the need to have specialized expertise to deal with risk that we can identify but not necessarily pinpoint, for us to get smarter about why is this particular transaction, relationship, deal off. And as we escalate into SMEs that can deal with those unusual activities or relationships to assess whether they are nonetheless legitimate, or if illegitimate, exactly why, we need those specialized expertise around AML, CFT, and sanctions to come in. So that's our kind of I think, history of a mission that has expanded deliberately to address all threats to international peace and security that may invade the financial system, starting with drug trafficking and all serious and organized crime, moving to terrorist financing and sanctionable activities or events, and how all of that requires a foundation of transparency that we then have to leverage to assess what the risk is in more detail that then allows us to put in place the countermeasures that we haven't even gotten to yet. So I'll pause there. I know it's a lot, but this is all, and sorry, I have to do this. All the more reason why for a community of stakeholders to understand this conversation in the detail that's required to be on a learning platform where that content is available, kept current in both a specialized way that can speak to AML, CFT, sanctions, but also in a way that ties together these elements of the mission through a baseline of understanding what it is that we're trying to do and what we need from a financial system that can be transparent for us to identify, assess, and manage risk. So a plug for you guys on the IFI side, but I can't help myself. It's one of the reasons why I love coming back here.
So let's turn to Russia. We've seen an unprecedented global response to Russia's invasion and aggression in Ukraine, both in terms of sanctions as well as strategic trade controls. I know you've written about this and advised and delivered training to public and private sector audiences around the world. Can you share your perspective on this campaign against Russia, especially having been a part of other multilateral sanctions regimes against countries like Iran, North Korea, and others? What's different about this one?
Wow, where to start? Maybe the right starting point is it's a great question, and it's one that obviously the IFI, K2 Integrity have a shared and I would say unique experience in answering because of the partnership that we have as training partners and capacity building partners with the State Department and the U.S. government to bring an understanding of this question and the threat behind it, as well as the response in the form of sanctions and trade controls, and what that means for markets, not just in the United States or subject to U.S. jurisdiction, but all over the world. Given what is different about this threat. And what is different, in my mind, you mentioned Iran, North Korea. There are other very heavily sanctioned jurisdictions, such as Cuba, Syria, and others in the past. But what makes this different is that Russia at the beginning of this invasion, and you could say 2014, which is really where it started, or 2022, when there was a literal invasion of Ukraine, to take Kiev as opposed to just the provinces in the east, that there was a G8 economy on the other side of this. And to address a collective security threat through sanctions and export controls, where that threat is a G8 economy, is a uniquely challenging proposition. Because in 2014, let alone 2022, the world was already so integrated with respect to supply chains, customer bases, and economic and financial relationships that taking a major economy and putting it under intense scrutiny at a minimum and sanctions in a targeted way that had many different dimensions to it was an incredibly, and I would argue, unprecedented complication for global markets to figure out. And whether you are in the financial system that has traditionally been the backbone of efforts to combat financial crime, or you are in the real economy, which is subject to sanctions obligations as much as the financial system is, or whether you are in between both in trade and finance, where you have to deal with sanctions and AML in certain respects, and certainly are the centerpiece of strategic trade controls. This was a problem that had unprecedented complexity with respect to understanding what the requirements are and dealing with this threat, not just from the United States, but from a global coalition of actors that includes primarily the EU, the UK, many elements of the G20, but is not a UN program. So while it's a global coalition, it's not a global sanctions or strategic trade control regime, because of course Russia sits at the UN Security Council and would veto any effort to truly globalize this, further complicating efforts to understand and implement requirements that are different from different authorities in different countries. So in a word, what makes Russia different? Complication associated with the size of that economy, and a global coalition that is nonetheless not a UN program. Those are the two starting points of complexity. And then maybe I'll add a third, which is that we've never seen the amount of importance or scrutiny associated with strategic trade controls in a campaign like what we're watching here. And so we've often said, or I've certainly stated this, whether people agree with it or not, that in many ways, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was the 9/11 moment for the export control community, where it became very clear that half of this battle is depriving the Russian government of the resources that it needs to wage this war over time. The other half of this battle is keeping as much equipment off the battlefield as possible. And strategic trade controls are important to both, but are essential to the second mission there. And so the pressure and the focus to demonstrate and implement effective trade controls that would keep important elements of warfare off the battlefield in Russia has never had that kind of focus before. So you have a G8 economy, you have undue complexity associated with a global coalition that is not a UN program, and you have a combination of strategic trade controls and sanctions building off of a foundation of AML transparency that basically amounts to an unprecedented challenge to the financial integrity mission. And I'll end with this piece. From a complexity and a challenge of implementation, there are questions that we would often face in the market, particularly from countries that are not necessarily subjected to these export controls or sanctions that many countries have adopted. The question was, everything you're saying just says this is almost impossible. So do we really need to do this? This is really hard. And is it ultimately going to be worthwhile? And that's a fair question. It's a question that we see in politics around countries that either have adopted certain measures or are debating others, or others are staying on the fence. And of course, the response to that has to come back to the threat. Why do we do this? And when we think about everything that we do as a financial integrity mission to combat threats to our collective security, that starts with you don't invade your neighbor. If you invade your neighbor, there are no rules. The rules are there are no rules. And if Europe learns that the consequences of a territorial invasion, not to mention cyberspace, that those principles upon which our entire United Nations Charter sits, if those principles are no longer sacrosanct, then there is no world order. There are no rules. And if we can't combat it in the face of Russia's aggression of the Ukraine, what happens to the rest of the former Soviet Union? What happens to the former Soviet bloc? What happens to our allies in NATO sitting in the Baltics? What happens to those on the fence from Moldova to those in Crimea? What happens to Ukraine itself? What happens to America's commitment to collective security? All those questions now become a heck of a lot more important in a world that's already pretty complicated. Look at what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Venezuela, what's happening in Niger. You go to every continent around the world and recognize that we have challenges of collective security where we cannot enforce the basic concept of world order around territorial integrity and political sovereignty, then we are in big, big trouble. And if being big immunizes you from that, then we've got real hard questions ahead of us about not just Russia, but other authoritarian regimes that have designs on changing their own borders, not to mention a whole continent whose borders have always been in question. So we've got to get this right. And as hard as the challenges are, if we don't get this right, the consequences will be harder to deal with.
Thanks so much for joining me today.
Wonderful being here. Thank you, Nikki, and looking forward to coming back at the first opportunity.